Kim Min Kyu became famous in the most dangerous way possible, by looking harmless. Born on December 25, 1994, he entered acting in 2013 and spent years building his career through supporting roles before the public finally began to notice what made him different. He appeared in dramas like Signal, Because This Is My First Life, Queen, Love and War, Backstreet Rookie, Snowdrop, Business Proposal, and The Heavenly Idol. But what made his rise so interesting was not only the work itself, it was the contrast inside his image. He looked gentle, polished, almost too clean to be threatening. The kind of actor audiences trust immediately without realizing how useful that trust can become on screen. That is exactly why Kim Min Kyu's story can be told in a much more shocking way than people expect. Because actors like him often get underestimated. The handsome second lead, the loyal secretary, the man with the warm smile and calm voice. But underneath that safe image is something far more compelling. A performer who quietly built himself through years of background work, then learned how to turn softness into obsession, elegance into tension, and emotional restraint into one of the sharpest tools in romantic drama. He did not explode into stardom with noise. He slipped into the public imagination so smoothly that many people did not notice how attached they had become until he was already impossible to ignore. And maybe that is the real hook in Kim Min Kyu's career. He was never just the actor who looked good in a frame. He was the actor who hid ambition, danger, and emotional precision behind a face everyone thought they could read too easily. Before Kim Min Kyu became the kind of actor viewers suddenly started calling unforgettable, his career was shaped by something much more frustrating: visibility without arrival. Public profiles list his acting debut in 2013, beginning with small roles before gradually moving through dramas such as Signal in 2016, Because This Is My First Life in 2017, The Rich Son in 2018, Perfume in 2019, and then later recognition through Queen, Love and War, Backstreet Rookie, Snowdrop, Business Proposal, and The Heavenly Idol. That filmography tells a very specific story. Kim Min Kyu was not absent from the industry. He was there the whole time. The audience kept seeing his face, but for years, the industry kept stopping just short of fully handing him the center. And that kind of career can quietly become its own psychological test, because there is something brutal about being memorable, but not yet indispensable, handsome enough to be noticed, stable enough to be cast, good enough to keep returning, yet still somehow positioned in the emotional edges of other people's stories. That was the strange tension in Kim Min Kyu's rise. He was not struggling in the obvious, dramatic way of someone who cannot enter the industry at all. He was struggling in the more painful way of someone who has already entered, already proved his value, and still has to keep waiting for the world to finally look at him as more than a supporting possibility. What makes this phase of his story so compelling is that it built the exact skill set that later made him dangerous on screen. When an actor spends years surviving through supporting roles, he learns economy. He learns how to leave a mark without needing the script to revolve around him. He learns how to create tension, romance, or intrigue in limited space. That is why Kim Min Kyu's later popularity did not feel accidental. By the time the wider public began truly responding to him, he had already spent years sharpening the ability to make small moments feel charged. Even the credits that looked smaller at the time were doing something important. Crime Scene Season 3 gave him variety show visibility. Queen, Love and War gave him his first leading role and a stronger image shift. And the years after that slowly pushed him from that familiar actor towards something more emotionally dangerous. The man audiences trusted too easily, right? Before realizing he was becoming the one they remembered most. And maybe that is why Kim Min Kyu's rise hits differently. He did not appear out of nowhere. He was hidden in plain sight for years. The shock was never that he suddenly became good. The shock was that once the spotlight finally moved toward him, people realized he had been ready long before they were. The most shocking thing about Kim Min Kyu's rise is not that he became popular. It is that once people finally started paying attention, they realized he had been dangerous all along. For years, he moved through Korean television as the kind of actor viewers recognized without fully claiming. He was there in Signal, Because This Is My First Life, The Rich Son, Perfume, and other roles that kept him visible but not yet central. Then the shape of his career started changing. His first leading role came with Queen, Love and War in 2019-2020, where he played Lee Kyung, the king of Joseon. That mattered because it was the first time the industry truly gave him the frame instead of just a corner of it. And suddenly, audiences could see what had been hiding in plain sight. Kim Min Kyu did not just support a story well, he could hold one. But the real explosion came later. Because sometimes an actor's biggest breakthrough does not happen when he first becomes the lead. Sometimes it happens when he plays the role that lets the audience become emotionally obsessed. For Kim Min Kyu, that role was Cha Sung-hoon in Business Proposal in 2022. On paper, he was not even the main lead. And yet, that is exactly what made it more powerful. He entered the drama as the controlled, elegant, second male fantasy. The man who seemed quiet, loyal, mature, and almost too composed to be dangerous. But that kind of restraint is exactly what made him magnetic. Viewers did not just like him, they started fixating on him. His pairing with Seol In-ah became one of the drama's biggest talking points, and he later won the Best Couple award with her at the 2022 SBS Drama Awards, along with an Excellence Award for his performance. That is when Kim Min Kyu stopped feeling like a familiar actor and started feeling like a public craving. What made this shift so effective was the contradiction in his image. He looked safe, but he generated tension. He smiled warmly, but there was control under it. He gave off the energy of someone emotionally dependable, yet somehow still hard to fully possess. In romantic drama, that combination is lethal. It makes audiences project far more than simple attraction onto a character. It makes them imagine intimacy, stability, and desire all at once. Kim Min Kyu became incredibly good at that very specific kind of emotional seduction. And because he had spent so many years sharpening himself in smaller roles, once the bigger wave of attention arrived, he knew exactly how to hold it. Then, The Heavenly Idol in 2023 pushed him even further, placing him at the center of a fantasy comedy premise and showing that the man once treated like a supporting visual could now carry a drama's emotional rhythm by himself. Whether every project hit equally hard or not, the transformation was complete. Kim Min Kyu was no longer the actor audiences happened to notice. He was the actor they started waiting for. And once that happens, the next problem is no longer getting attention. It is surviving the pressure that comes when people suddenly expect the face they once overlooked to keep delivering fantasy on command. Once Kim Min Kyu stopped being overlooked, his career entered a much more dangerous phase. Because there is a special kind of pressure that comes when the public suddenly decides you are not just attractive or talented, but desirable, not in a casual way, in a consuming way. The kind that turns an actor into a projection screen for fantasy, romance, safety, and longing all at once. That is what happened to Kim Min Kyu after Business Proposal. He had already been working for nearly a decade, but now the attention around him was no longer about whether he was promising. It was about whether he could keep being exactly the kind of man viewers had unexpectedly fallen for. And that is a trap, because Kim Min Kyu's appeal was never built on loud seduction. He did not arrive like a rebellious heartthrob or an emotionally dangerous anti-hero. He arrived as something subtler, polished, controlled, reliable, elegant, warm, and just distant enough to keep the fantasy alive. That made him incredibly easy for audiences to desire. But it also meant that once the public began wanting him in that very specific way, every next role carried a hidden demand. Do not break the feeling. That is where success becomes heavier than it looks. His work after the breakthrough reflects that tension. With The Heavenly Idol in 2023, Kim Min Kyu stepped into a lead role that asked him to carry fantasy, humor, and emotional sincerity at the same time. It was another sign that the industry now trusted him with center stage energy rather than just supportive charm. But by this point, the challenge was no longer only performance. It was image management. The audience that had once discovered him with delight was now watching much more intensely, not just to enjoy him, but to see whether he still felt like himself, that polished fantasy they had become attached to. This is one of the strangest things about sudden desire in showbiz. The more the audience romanticizes a star, the less freedom that star has to move naturally. If he changes too much, the fantasy collapses. If he repeats himself too often, the fantasy goes stale. Kim Min Kyu was now living inside that balance. He had to remain emotionally appealing without becoming predictable. elegant without becoming bland, warm without becoming ordinary. It is a much harder task than simply becoming famous. And yet, there is something especially compelling about him in this phase precisely because of that tension. Kim Min Kyu does not look like a star fighting to dominate the room. He looks like a star trying to hold on to the strange emotional spell he cast on the audience almost by accident. That makes his success feel more fragile, and in some ways more addictive. Because viewers sense that what they want from him is not just another role. They want the same feeling they got when they first realized he was more magnetic than they had expected. That is the hidden weight of his rise. For years, he suffered from being seen but not chosen. Now he had become chosen so intensely that the risk had changed entirely. The danger was no longer invisibility. It was overexposure, projection, and the public hunger that comes when a once overlooked actor suddenly becomes the man everyone wishes they had noticed sooner. Kim Min Kyu is not a scandal-driven celebrity, and that, ironically, is exactly what makes his situation more psychologically intense. Because when an actor builds his image on elegance, politeness, and emotional stability, when he becomes the kind of man audiences describe as perfect, ideal, or boyfriend material, the public does something very specific. They stop watching him from a distance. They start owning the image, not literally, but emotionally. They begin to feel like they understand him, like they have a claim over what he should be, how he should act, and even what kind of roles or relationships would fit him. That is where pressure begins to turn invisible. Unlike stars whose careers are filled with loud scandals, controversies around Kim Min Kyu's image have always been quieter. They do not explode in headlines as much as they circulate through expectations, comparisons, and subtle shifts in audience reaction. After Business Proposal, for example, his chemistry with co-star Seol In-ah became so beloved that it blurred the line between performance and reality for many viewers. This is a common phenomenon in K-drama culture, but it becomes more intense when the actor's image is already built on emotional sincerity. Suddenly, fans are not just enjoying a fictional pairing. They are hoping it reflects something real. And when reality does not follow the script, a strange kind of disappointment can appear. Not loud, but persistent. That kind of projection is one of the quietest forms of pressure in the industry. At the same time, his too-perfect image can also become a double-edged sword. In online discussions and fan spaces, actors like Kim Min Kyu are sometimes described as too safe or too clean, especially when compared to stars with more chaotic, rebellious, or controversial personas. This creates a subtle tension. The very traits that made him desirable can also limit how seriously some audiences take his range or unpredictability. He is admired, but sometimes underestimated, loved, but occasionally seen as lacking edge. And that is where the real challenge lies. Because breaking that perception requires risk. But risk is dangerous when your entire appeal is built on emotional trust. If Kim Min Kyu suddenly shifts too far into darker, more morally complex roles, he risks disrupting the fantasy that made him popular. But if he stays within the same polished, romantic image, he risks being trapped inside it. That balance is not visible in headlines, but it shapes every decision he makes. What makes his career fascinating at this stage is that he is navigating a form of pressure that is almost entirely internalized. There is no major scandal forcing him to rebuild his image. There is no dramatic fall from grace. Instead, there is something quieter and in many ways more difficult. The expectation to remain exactly who people think he is while still proving that he can be more. And maybe that is the most underrated struggle in Kim Min Kyu's story. He is not fighting to recover from controversy. He is fighting to evolve without breaking the illusion that made people fall for him in the first place. Today, Kim Min Kyu stands in a position that looks stable on the surface, but is far more complex underneath. He is no longer the actor struggling to be noticed. That phase is over. After years of quiet buildup through Signal, Because This Is My First Life, and others, followed by the breakout impact of Business Proposal and his leading turn in The Heavenly Idol, he has secured something many actors spend their entire careers chasing: recognition, demand, and emotional attachment from the audience. But what makes his current moment interesting is not that he succeeded. It is what that success now requires him to do next. Because Kim Min Kyu is no longer just building a career. He is managing an illusion. The illusion of being the perfect man. The calm one. The elegant one. the emotionally reliable one, the man who feels safe to want. And illusions like that do not stay static. They either evolve or they break. That is why the next stage of his career will define him far more than his rise did. If he leans too heavily into the same romantic, polished roles, the audience may slowly lose the intensity of their attachment. But if he pushes too far into darker, more complex territory, he risks disrupting the very emotional connection that made him popular. The challenge is not choosing one or the other. It is finding a way to hold both at the same time. And maybe that is the real story of Kim Min Kyu. Not how he became famous, but whether he can transform from a man people project into a man they are willing to keep watching, even when the illusion starts to change.